Hello, and welcome to this online gallery tour that I'm calling Exhibiting Architecture. So I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Jessica Kelley. I teach at the Farnham campus where I do Contextual and Theoretical Studies for the graphic design course, and sometimes teach on advertising as well. I also have the role of Research Degrees Leader, where I work with the PhD students and the research degree students that we have at UCA. So my own research looks at what I would describe as the intersections between visual communication, media and architecture. And that spans all different types of media. But in my PhD, I focused specifically on magazines. My PhD was about the Architectural View magazine, which began publication in the 19th century and is still published today. I focused on it for the period between 1932 and 1971 because my PhD was focused on its editor, J.M. Richards, or Jim Richards as he was called. The picture there on the screen of one of my favourite front covers of the magazine, actually, from 1937, the special issue about interior design, and a picture there from Jim Richards' passport in the early 30s. So that's what my PhD research was about and what I continue to look at. I finished my PhD in 2014 and I continue to research around these ideas. So when Charlotte contacted me and asked me to do a gallery tour, a virtual tour, as we were in lockdown, I immediately thought about this idea of talking about how architecture and exhibitions interact. I did look at exhibitions in my PhD research, and I've written about and published about exhibitions as a means of communicating ideas about modern architecture to the public, specifically in Britain. And these are two historical exhibitions that I looked at in my research. The first was in 1938 in London, organised by the Modern Architecture Research Group, of which Richards was a member. And there are two images here on the left of the screen. One was a model living room that the Mars group put together, and you can see there the kind of bookshelves of books and the chair and the sofas and lots of built-in technology, kind of a built-in radio there to show the sort of modern home of the future. I also like to imagine the architects encouraging the audiences to imagine themselves living in this environment as a kind of backdrop to their modern lives. And the bottom image there is from another room in the Mars exhibition where they looked at garden design, again showing, you can just about make it out there, a sort of patio and a sort of gazebo type structure, accompanied by photographs of existing modern buildings that had been built around the world during that period. So the whole exhibition was really about promoting modernism as a way of life, as well as a sort of design style and a design ethos, a set of principles. The second exhibition, right-hand side of the screen, was very, very different, a very different approach to the idea of exhibiting architecture. It was called the Live Architecture Exhibition, and it was part of the Festival of Britain that happened in the UK after the end of the war. So it was in 1951. And this exhibition was in East London, mainly in Poplar, which is a poor area in Easton near the docks of the River Thames. And before the war, it had been sort of designated a slum area. There was lots of very poor quality housing, lots of overcrowding, lots of people living very close to industry in the docks, so sort of unsanitary, unhygienic ways of living. And it was chosen by the Architecture Committee of the Festival of Britain as the site to hold this living exhibition of architecture. And again, I chose to focus on it because J.M. Richards was a member of the Architecture Committee and he was involved in this. So he worked on both of these exhibitions, which are sort of, they're about 15 years apart, just under. And they show a sort of real change in the way of thinking about talking to audiences about what architecture can do. It also shows changing ideas about the audience and the relationship between architects and their public. So the live architecture exhibition were actual houses that were being built. They were new housing estates and new facilities like churches and schools and old people's homes and pubs and marketplaces, all being built in this area of Wimpler. They're all still there. You can go and visit them, which is one of the things I did during my PhD. Was sort of, I lived near there at the time, and I went on a little walking tour where I recreated one of the walks around the area that was part of the exhibition. And it's very interesting to see it now as a place, sort of 60 years later, that people do live in, and it has communities in it. When it was being built as part of this exhibition, it was very aspirational and very almost like propaganda. For the future of Britain and the role of modern architecture within that. So for me, these are two really fascinating examples of different ways that architects have tried to use exhibitions to communicate with the public and with their audiences and share their ideas, and sort of try to promote and to persuade people about their about architects' ideas and perceptions of what architecture is and what it should be. So that's from my own research, and as you can tell, I'm a historian, a sort of architectural design historian. The two exhibitions I want to really talk about today are in the recent past, I suppose. They also deal with history, but they also deal with art as well, and the relationship between display, designed objects, and the ideas about architecture. So the two exhibitions I've chosen are Living with Buildings, which was held at the Wellcome Collection in London at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And another one, which is a little bit earlier, was an installation called Tomorrow by the Artistic Partnership of Elm Green and Dragset, which was installed in the V&A Museum for a few months at the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014. So there's quite good online representations of both of these exhibitions, and I'm going to sort of just talk through the images in them and I think is interesting about them. So I'm going to talk about why I think they're interesting. I'm going to pick up on some key objects or displays within both of them and think about the ideas they sparked in me and what I thought about them, and some reflections on how I think these two exhibitions affect our thinking and our ideas about architecture. So I'm going to start with the more recent exhibition, the Living with Buildings at the Wellcome Collection. So you bear with me while I swap to sharing the images of the exhibition. So I want to say something just to start with about the Wellcome Collection itself. Very interesting, complicated organisation. So the Wellcome Collection was based on the collection of a man called Henry Wellcome, who was a pharmaceutical salesman, sort of brand designer, whose industry eventually became GlaxoSmithKline, or was bought up by them later on. And as well as running that business and earning an awful lot of money, making an awful lot of money, and setting up his charitable institution, which is the Wellcome Institute, which funds a lot of research into medicine and pharmaceuticals, there's also the collection that he gathered. He was a sort of philanthropist, collector, explorer, and all of in the late 19th and early 20th century. And all of what we now know to be the very problematic and complicated issues that go along with that, the idea of a sort of white Western Christian man who would go and visit lots of cultures in all over the world and sort of gather up objects to do with medicine and to do with the sort of treatment of ailments within those cultures. And he made this collection, and that became the basis of the Wellcome Collection. So there's lots of kind of complex issues around it as a collection and its historical implications, of which I think the current managers of the Wellcome Collection are having interesting conversations about. And you can go on the website above and look at the collections and look at the stories from that collections where they are prompting audiences to ask questions about that material. But alongside that permanent collection, the Wellcome Collection also put on exhibitions. The one they did after living with buildings was one called Can Graphic Design Save Your Life, which is a really great title, I think, and something which a lot of my graphic design students found very interesting. And the book that went along with it, lots of them have used that in their essays and writing since. But the one I want to talk about is this one, Living with Buildings. And the idea behind the exhibition was to explore exactly that idea of how do people interact with buildings and architecture, and what is the sort of reciprocal relationship? How do buildings impact on us as we use and interact with them, and how do we impact on architecture? And it took a historical look at those ideas, as well as looking at some contemporary examples. So this image is just from within the exhibition, so you can start to get a sense of the design of it. All of the Wellcome exhibitions happen in this one big gallery space, where they often then have to use temporary room dividers to create smaller spaces within it. So it's from an exhibition design perspective, it's quite interesting how they manage this one big room and change how people move through it and look at the material and interact with the material. This main image on the screen here is quite interesting. I thought at the time when I visited it that it was this huge model of a hospital being built in London in the early 20th century, and the model was a fundraising it was like a piece of publicity made to advertise and to encourage people to donate towards the building of this hospital. And it was absolutely huge. I mean, you can see the scale from the images of the people in there. It really dominated the space. So again, from a design perspective, they made some interesting choices. But I'm not going to talk about that too much today. What I want to do is, using the website where they kind of sum up what the exhibition is about. Here, as you can see, the opening line, we're surrounded by buildings all the time. How do they affect our physical and mental health? So because it's the Wellcome Collection, it has this focus on well-being and medicine and health. But it does also look at sort of broader questions. The thing that's most interesting for me in this exhibition was the use of media objects to explore architecture. And it raised, I think, lots of interesting questions about the type of visual media communication objects that are generated when we look at architecture, when we try to understand the relationship between people and architecture, and also the kind of graphic visual communication material that's generated by trying to represent that relationship, by trying to persuade people or advertise it or communicate ideas about it. So going through the exhibition highlights, which are here, and they've picked 11 sort of key bits, the curators have then given a brief description about what they're about. So as you can see, there's a real range from contemporary art projects like this, Andreas Gursky's photographic project about people living in this large modernist housing block in France and how they interact with it. There are the individual furniture objects, like this one designed by Alvo Aalto, who was an architect, who designed this chair to sit within the sanatorium that he designed in Finland for the treatment of tuberculosis patients. So looking at how architecture may not even can exist on the scale of furniture as well as big, the sort of building itself and the rooms, but even down to the decoration and the furniture, that is architecture as well. Another art project there about the demolition of a hospital in London, and this artist who filmed it and reflected on the history of the building through that film. This is the first of the media objects that I want to talk about. I'm not doing these in chronological order. This is a sort of newer image than the second one I want to talk about, but I want to talk about them because this is the order they come in the exhibition. So the first image is a poster produced by Abram Games, who was a graphic designer born in the East End of London, so interestingly enough, a similar area to where the live architecture exhibition I talked about from my own research. He was born in near Whitechapel, which is not far from Poplar. So he was born in that area of London, and he became a graphic designer. He studied originally at the Central School, which has later become Central St Martin's, but he left after 2 terms. He didn't enjoy it. And he sort of got his break into graphic design by working for London Transport in the middle of the 1930s. London Transport's promotional material, its advertising and its promotion was managed by a man called Frank Pick. And there's an awful lot written about him as a important and influential person in promotional culture. But he employed Abram Games as a freelance poster designer. And that was Abram Games' first step into becoming a professional designer. By the time that this poster was made, which is in 1941, I think, so by that point, Games is a really well-established visual communication designer, graphic designer as we would now call him. And this poster was designed as part of a public education campaign designed to promote thinking about the future of Britain after the war. So this is the point in the Second World War where sort of the government and the state organisations in the UK are starting to look to thinking about, well, what's going to happen after the conflict is finished? What are we going to do? And Games designed this poster to encourage people to think about the sort of brighter future that may be to come. And I think it's a fascinating use of architecture within a piece of graphic design. It also then has a big impact on architecture after war, which I won't talk about too much, but lots of the kind of modernist housing and regeneration projects that happened after the war were kind of influenced by these ideas. But what Games is showing here at the front is a building that was already built in 1938 in Finsbury in North London. It's the Finsbury Health Centre. And as it describes down here, Berthold Lebetkin is the architect of the Finsbury Health Centre under a architectural firm called Tektron that he founded. And he designed this health centre together with the Labour Council of Finsbury in the late 1930s. Again, Finsbury was a very poor area, lots of slum housing, lots of very poor sanitary conditions. And the Finsbury Health Centre was designed to provide healthcare and health advice for the inhabitants of Finsbury. And it has these it's built on very modernist principles of open air, lots of light, lots of glass. It's actually, you can sort of see here, but it's this almost, it looks like it's got 2 arms, the building. So it's almost opening its arms to the community, and people would enter through this little walkway here into the building. It's still standing, it's still there. It's right near Exmouth Market, if anybody knows London. Has ever been there, you can still walk past it. It still functions as a health centre. But what's interesting, I think, here is the sort of image of Britain that Games is putting forward and asking people to fight for. It says here, "You're Britain, fight for it now." So to fight for this image of improvement and betterment that could happen after the war, because it had started before the war broke out. So the Finsbury Health Centre was built in 1938. And it's juxtaposed, it's this opposite of this sort of squalor and degradation behind this sort of ruined building, this small child here looking, you know, poorly dressed and very thin, playing amongst the ruins of this building. It's sort of asking the audience to think, what is the future you're fighting for? What is the future you're looking to improve? And fundamentally, it's using architecture as the means of showing that juxtaposition and showing a future that could be fought for. So for me, this is a real intersection of architecture and visual communication, the use of graphic design to communicate ideas about architecture as a reforming force within society, and to use architecture as a kind of propagandist or promotional tool. I mean, this is at the end of the day encouraging people to get involved in the war effort. So it does have that propagandist element. And the curators of the exhibition have added in this line, which I think is really fascinating as well, that Churchill, as Prime Minister during the war in Britain, actually removed this poster from the propaganda campaign, saying that it was a disgraceful libel on the conditions of Great Britain before the war. So he disagreed with this idea that Britain had been, you know, a site of poverty and ill health for lots of its population, and that part of the war was about fighting for an improved condition through the kind of socialised modernist healthcare that was embodied within the Finsbury Health Centre. And that was the opposite of what Churchill was thinking as a Conservative MP. It wasn't the kind of message he wanted to put across. So this is quite a controversial image as well at the time, which I think is interesting. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Then just going to scroll down again. This is the promotional model of the hospital, and it gives some details there about how Queen Mary donated some lace handkerchiefs to be used in the model to give it, again, a sort of royal link. There are some interesting things, just scroll down a little bit, about the Wellcome Institute itself and how they got involved in planning for healthier communities. This is some designs for the idea for something called Welcomeville, which was an ideal community being planned by Wellcome. But I've scrolled past my next example, which is this. This is the second thing I want to talk about in the Living with Buildings exhibition. And it's from much earlier than my first example. It's from the late 19th century. And it's a map of an area of London, which was produced by a man called Charles Booth, who was, as it says there, a wealthy businessman who was sort of horrified by the conditions that he encountered in London, especially in areas like East London and certain particular areas of North London and South London, sort of pockets of really extreme poverty. And in order to try and capture that, so could communicate it to governments, but also to other wealthy people, he was a sort of philanthropist. He wanted to create kind of a communicative object that could capture his research, capture his data, in order for him to be able to use it to communicate these ideas and persuade people. So the Booth maps of London, which were put together in 1889, you can just see the date right at the top there. It's called a Descriptive Map of London Poverty. And he gathered together groups of investigators, and he would go as well on excursions to areas of London, where they would then gather information about the levels of accommodation and sanitary conditions in each of the areas, and record in this colour-coded way the conditions within each of the areas, ranging from wealthy and well-off and to the sort of poorest and most insanitary environments. It's interesting. The Charles Booth maps are actually all digitised through LSE, and the London School of Economics. They've got that archive and they've digitised all the information and all of the notebooks that Charles Booth used when he was gathering this information. And this is over 100 years ago. Lots of the sort of judgment language that the observers use, we would find quite shocking today. But then also we might recognise it in some of the media portrayals of different groups within our society today. So it's an interesting example of research into social conditions and research into people's living conditions and people's interactions with architecture, you know, how they live in these buildings and how it affects their health and their ability to live their lives in a healthy. But it also, for me, is a really fascinating example of the use of visual communication to capture data and communicate it in a legible way. The colour coding of these maps and the key at the bottom here, which details what those colours show, create this immediately legible image of the city that communicated Booth's idea about the relationship between the rich and the poor within London, about the need for reform within particular areas, and importantly, the role of architecture in that, the need for better housing, better sanitary facilities, better organisation of the city, and that this piece of graphic material, this communicative piece of visual design, was really instrumental in the project. So for an exhibition about buildings and about our relationship with buildings, for me, two of the most interesting objects are graphic objects, are communicative tools for explaining that relationship between buildings and people and buildings. So for me, that's what I found so interesting about this exhibition, was how living with buildings is not just about our relationship with the built environment, the actual buildings that we see, like this first image is about where people live and how they live in those environments, but all of the exhibits are about the use of visual communication to capture and reflect those relationships. So the exhibition itself kind of summed up those intersections for me between graphics, visual communication, and architecture, and then our experiences of architecture and our relationships with it. So you can go for yourself and flick through the other things that were there in the exhibition. I think it's a helpful and interesting sort of capturing of the exhibition. There's also a book about living with buildings by Ian Sinclair, which is also available as a sort of legacy of this exhibition. So that's living with buildings. I now want to talk about my next example, which is Tomorrow by Elm Green and Dragset. So the V&A itself doesn't hold a particularly helpful set of images about this exhibition, so I'm using a different website, this Contemporary Art magazine website, which captured a lot of the images from the exhibition. So I'm going to be using that rather than the V&A's website itself for this brief discussion of the exhibition. But it's important to say that it was it was installed at the V&A Museum in what were formerly the textile galleries of the V&A. I believe the textile galleries were being redesigned at the point that they did this exhibition, which is why they had this free gallery space in order to. So this is a very different idea to the first example that I gave. The first example was about communicating the history of the ideas about our relationship with architecture in terms of health and well-being. This exhibition is very different. So Elm Green and Dragset are artists, it says here, as you can see, Scandinavian artists whose work often explores the ideas around design and architecture and art and how those things interact. They're also quite politically engaged as artists, and they often produce art that engages with questions around political issues, the status of artists, of designers, and their responsibility in society and in culture. But why this exhibition for me was so interesting and formative, and I should say that this exhibition appeared just at the time that I had completed my PhD. I submitted my PhD in August of 2013, and I had my viva in the November of 2013. So it's exactly at the time that this exhibition came out. And I think that might have been why it sort of stayed with me for so long, because it really felt like it was highlighting a lot of the issues that had been really interesting to me during my PhD research. So the premise of the exhibition is that it's an abandoned set for a film to be made about, with the two main characters of the film being two architects, one called Norman Swan, who was a retired architect who had been very involved in modernism, in the sort of post-war architecture of reconstruction of housing estates, and the sort of live architecture exhibition that I was looking at in my research. And the other character in the imagined film that would take place in this setting, Daniel Wilder, who was a former pupil of Norman Swan, who sort of gave up architecture and became an interior decorator or an interior designer, who was much more interested in kind of postmodern ideas around decoration and expression, and sort of rejected a lot of the ideas that were integral to post-war modernism that this imagined figure of Norman Swan would have been teaching him. And the way this worked is that as you entered the exhibition rooms, which you walked through, you had a script, which was the interaction between Norman and Daniel Wilder, that was supposed to be played out within these rooms. So that was the experience of being in the space. And that in and of itself, I think, is an interesting idea in terms of the idea of the role of representation in the form of film in our understanding of architecture, and specifically in our understanding of the role of architects, what we understand architects to do, and who they are and how they behave, comes very often from how they're represented in the media. So taken as an idea, as an imagined representation of architects as a starting point is quite interesting. But what I found particularly relevant to my research, which has been trying to understand how architects communicate themselves, how architects use objects and media specifically to communicate ideas beyond their own practice audience, is how much of that comes out in the objects that were being used in this set that Screen and Dragset have put together as sort of signifiers of the identity of this architect. And the first one is here, that you can see in the bottom corner here, is the drawing board of the architect. When I was doing my PhD, I started collecting images from the magazines I was looking at of architects sitting at drawing boards. And it was a real trope, a real kind of visual thing that was repeated. An image of an architect sat at a drawing board was sort of repeated in over and over again. So the fact that that drawing board was there, I was like, oh, straight away they want you to think of the modern architect. And the other image, part of this, which I think is really interesting, is here, this poster of his desk, which reminds me of the Abraham Games poster, promoting and advertising the role of architecture. It says building for the masses, and has these images of these blocks of housing that look very similar to the block of flats that opened the Healthy Buildings exhibition on the Wellcome website. So it's picking up on the idea that media objects were very important for defining the role of architecture, not only for the public, but for architects themselves. Architects understood the role of media in establishing their part in society and then promoting that to the rest of the world, and certainly to publics within the UK. So what I'm going to do is just flick through these images and talk about what I think was significant about this imagined set that they put together, which was supposed to be the house of Norman Swan. The story was that Daniel Wilder had purchased Swan's house and had come to and arrived at it, and Norman Swan was still there. He was still living there, and all of his things were still there. So again, this taps into another idea that I think is really interesting, which is about how the objects that we surround ourselves with, how we furnish the spaces that we live within, communicate about our identities and about our sense of self, even when we're not necessarily thinking that other people will see them, but then also when we are thinking of how we display things within our domestic spaces, thinking when people will visit or when people will see that. So this was the first room you walk into, which is the living room or the parlour or something. And this huge cabinet displaying kind of books and ornaments and things, which were some of them from the V&A collection, but put together in this way that they're supposed to represent a living room. And again, this reminded me of the Mars living room that they put together. The styles are very different. This doesn't look very modernist. It looks much more traditional, much more sort of the history of objects and design that this architect is trying to reflect, their sense of history, their belonging to this history. But the idea of a living room as a background to live out your idealized identity, or that would represent your identity to anyone who visited. I think there's real parallels between this and the Mars exhibition. So Elmsnet and Elm Green and Dragset are picking up on this idea of architects using spaces and domestic environments to communicate ideas about themselves. There's a larger shot there, and as you can see, I mean, it's really funny how also they've made this huge gallery space feel like someone's living room by just using little things like the rug and the lamp and the little set here with sofas around the table. This is the living room, the sort of half-finished set. Again, it's sort of that funny thing of it's set up for angles as though it were being filmed. So some of it is not finished because that wouldn't be in the shot. This is another, again, this is the workroom or the studio for the architect. So I think there's so much to be said there for the construction of what an architect is. And I want to draw attention to all of the magazines here. This is the bedroom. I want to find this one image of the shelves. These are working drawings. Again, the idea of the architect there with his drawings. This is what the image I was looking for, the shelves. Because again, all of the magazines here. So part of my research was looking at the role of magazines as part of what architects do. Part of their practice is writing about their own work and about the work of others and producing images of it in order to present that to an audience, to another reader through the magazine. So I was really pleased to see just how many magazines were there, because it helped me feel like my image of architects as people really fascinated, or as a profession really fascinated by how they're presented in the media, and often producing their own media to control that. I was really pleased to see all of these magazines here. But then also these models again reminded me of the Living with Buildings exhibition, where the promotional model is there, and models are often made in order to win pitches for architectural competitions. So these as promotional objects themselves, as well as design tools. I think it's very interesting, and the fact that here next to the magazines is that these are all promoting the role of the architect. They're all kind of constructing and then communicating the transformative role of the architect to the audience. So I skipped over some images there, but again, the sort of stylistic choices are really interesting. That relationship between very modern images and much more opulent historical types of design, showing again the sort of maybe internal contradictions within modernism that seemed to try to reject a lot of ornamentation or a lot of opulence, but actually the architects doing it were perhaps more interested in historical objects and that kind of history. This final one, this is actually a copy of the architectural review here on the desk of this the side table of this architect. So again, the sort of central part of the media within architecture is there being communicated. So I think beyond talking about how it rang very true of my own research into architectural culture in the UK and the relationship between the media and architecture. I think the other thing that was so powerful for me with this exhibition was how evocative it was. And the idea of objects as being evocative, this is an idea that Sherry Turkle writes about in her book Evocative Objects, where she talks about the power of objects to kind of hold meaning and then communicate that meaning across time and space. And something like this, like the table of framed photographs that kind of act like talisman, you know, they hold the emotion of that person for the person who owns these images. That this becomes an image of someone's life and their relationships. These ones here about the sort of professional networking, and these ones here being more about the kind of family and personal relationships. So what they've done in creating this exhibition, I think, is first of all done a very interesting reflection on the relation between objects and identity, the power of objects to evoke identity and evoke atmosphere and evoke narrative. But also then, in terms of my research into media and architecture, they've done a very interesting reflection on architects constructing an image of themselves and using the media to communicate that image, and vice versa. The media creating representations of architects, as in this imaginary film set being one, that create this mythology around the architect and a mythology around that profession and how we understand it. So there's kind of 3 layers of stuff, I think, going on in that exhibition, which I just found really fascinating. So I want to finish on this final slide, which comes from my own research and goes back to that idea of the image of the architect. This is an advert taken from the Architecture Review in 1943. So still during the war, and it's an image of an architect here sat at a drawing board working away trying to design post-war homes, and this woman here, this presumably we're supposed to think of her as a housewife, she's holding up a leg of lamb and a pint of milk, and she's saying, yes, but where's this going to be put, demanding the architect to think about the person who's going to be living in the house, the things that they're going to want to do. And this is an advert by a refrigeration company. So it was published in the Architecture Review. So it's the refrigeration company trying to advocate for their consumers and demand that architects think about how to put the refrigeration in the new houses that they're building for after the war. So for me, these 2 exhibitions, the idea about how we interact with buildings and how objects and media can construct an image of the architect, both of those ideas from those 2 exhibitions kind of culminate in this advert, which is in itself a piece of graphic communication that tells us so much about architects' role in society, their perceived role by themselves and by others, that then gets communicated through advertising. So I'm going to end there, and I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to do this talk. It's been really interesting. It's been wonderful to revisit these 2 exhibitions and think about the relationships that they had to each other and what to my research, why they stuck with me for all these years, why I've thought of them as such interesting examples of exhibiting architecture. So thank you very much.